Hi, and welcome to this video where we're going to learn about PySpark streaming and how to customize it with the applyInPandasWithState. This is part 1 of 3 where we're going to look at the introduction and background as to why we might want to use the applyInPandasWithState and what we're going to do to customize it. In part 2, we'll then create some test data that we can use for streaming, and then in part 3 will be the bulk of the tutorials where we'll specifically look at the applyInPandasWithState, and we're going to go through a fully worked example of how to implement it. There are 2 notebooks that accompany these videos, and you can download them from my website, which is www.padsresearch.co.uk. I'll put a link to that in the description, and you'll also find 3 written articles that accompany these videos on that website as well, so you should be able to find that link in the description below. Now, to stop YouTube from recommending your next video as a random cat video, then the best thing to do is subscribe, and that should hopefully then direct you to the correct next video. I'll also put a link at the end of this video that goes to the next video after part 1. Let's first start by thinking about PySpark structured streaming in general, and there's basically 2 states that we can really operate in. We can either operate in a stateless state or a stateful state. So a stateless state is where we stream a record or a batch of records, and we don't really care about any of the other records. So all the calculations we want to do, all the derivations we want, only really apply to that particular record or that particular batch that we've taken through in the stream. A stateful state, however, means that actually some of the calculations we want to do involve looking at the other records. So we might receive a batch of records, but actually we want to compare that to a previous batch or the next batch of records that we might receive. We might want to do this, for example, if we want to group data. So if we want to group data by a particular item, we might want to get the previous records and the records coming up that all fall into that group, and then perhaps aggregate or count those records. And this requires a little bit of definition and a little bit of logic as to how we maintain that state. So we can stream data in 3 different modes. The default mode that we stream data in is the complete mode. That means that every time we get a new record, we basically rewrite the entire set of data that we already had into our destination table. Now that's obviously fine with smaller sets of data or in testing. That state is obviously going to get ginormous and start to become unpractical fairly quickly. So we tend to avoid complete mode for anything other than really testing. The next mode is the most common, so that's append mode. And that means that every time we get a new record, we just write it to our destination. That will only ever write new records, and it won't, for example, update existing records that are already there. And this is the mode that is most commonly used. The final mode is update mode, so that is able to update existing records that are already there and append new records. So how do these modes relate to state management? If we're going to be using the applyInPandasWithState function, then what we're really interested in is managing a stateful process. So i.e. we're keeping track of previous and future records, and we're putting those into a group and holding that as a state. Now, if we use the out-of-the-box functionality, then what it is basically doing is holding a running total of aggregate values. So for example, if we were to receive a record that says red and we had 1 of them, then it would take a count of 1. If we then received another record that was also red, and this time it had 2 widgets, then it would add up the previous one, which is 1, add that to the 2, and we'd have 3. So what it's holding in its state is a running aggregate or a running total of all those records in that group. If we're using append mode, then remember what that means. We can only write new records. So for example, if our group is green and the first record we get in has 3 widgets, the second one has another 3 widgets, and we're having a running count of that, that means we can't write that total count for that group until all of our records are in for that group. So that means we can't output a running total of everything that's in that group. And that can be an issue if you need that running total live as data's coming in, because it won't end up in your data until everything's finished. So to get around that, we also have update mode, and that will enable you to output that data as the data comes in. And you don't have to wait until your group is finished in order to write it to your final destination, i.e. your delta table. But there's a problem with the update mode in that it's not compatible with Unity Catalog, and we can't actually write the data to delta tables. So that means that the update mode might not work for us either. And then finally we've got complete mode, which does enable us to keep doing updates, but it's just slowly going to get a larger and larger and larger and larger state. And when we're running in production, that's just not going to work for us either. So we end up in a situation where if we want to continually update or have a running total of our groups, then we can't use append mode, we can't use update mode, and we can't do complete mode. So now we're a little bit stuck, so what do we do? Well, the solution is to use applyInPandasWithState, and this enables us to customize how we manage our state. So let's look at how this works. So the first thing that happens is that we receive data in our stream. So we receive batches, and that gets converted into a pandas data frame. Now, each group that we've assigned, so if we had red or green, will end up in its own pandas data frame. So all our records that relate to red will be in one pandas data frame, and all our records that relate to green will be in another data frame. Once we've received our batch of data and it's in our pandas data frames, we now need to store that somewhere. So we're going to this time create a custom state, where previously that state was managed for us. This time we're going to manage a state ourselves. Now this state is stored in a tuple, and we can put anything in that tuple that we want. So we could do the same as the off-the-shelf functionality. We could have running totals of things, we could have a count or a average value that we store in this tuple. Or we could do anything else that we want. So you can store anything in a tuple. You can store a dictionary or a list or any other type of Python object. So if we have a particular customized need that we need to store in our state, then we can design that to be anything that we want to be, as long as we can put it inside of a tuple. When we use the applyInPandasWithState, we need to specify a few things. So we need to specify what the schema of this tuple should be. We need to specify how we're going to group the data. So perhaps we want to group it on color. And we also need to think about how the state times out. So we could do that on a timer, so it just resets every 5 minutes, or there could be a particular condition that resets our state. And this state is held in memory. So let's just recap then. So we have a streaming input, and we receive batches of data inside pandas data frames. These are then converted into tuples and stored as a state, and we can custom write logic to decide how we store that data in a tuple. We then have a data output, and that could be something like outputting an update of our running total every time we get a new record. We need to define what the schema of that output is. Now, in the example we're going to do, we want to do some upsert statements, and therefore every time we receive a batch, we're going to upsert our delta table. And so we're also going to employ the forEachBatch function. So we'll have some streaming input, we'll then store that data in a state, we'll output that data as a pandas data frame, and then we'll write that data to our delta table using the forEachBatch. So this series of videos is about showing you a worked example. So now let's look at the scenario under which we're going to have a go. I want you to imagine that we are an airline company and we've got, let's say, 20 aircraft in the sky at any one time. And what we're doing is we have a number of sensors in that aircraft that we continuously monitor. So for example, we might monitor the vibration of the engine or the fuel flow or various other different conditions. And every time that aircraft takes off and lands, then all those readings that we get during that flight is a particular group. We're going to continue to take all those aircraft readings or all those sensor readings during the flight. We're going to store those in the state, and then we're going to use an AI model to continuously analyze all that data to look to see if there's any issues that might happen. We also need to continuously provide that data to our maintenance teams on the ground, so we also need to write that data out to a delta table that can then be used to write reports against. Now, we don't want to have to wait until the aircraft has landed before we can take all the data from that state and write it to our delta table. We want those continuous updates live as we get them from the aircraft, because we don't want to land and then realise we had a problem with the aircraft. We want to be alerted immediately that there's a problem with the aircraft and be able to both alert the crew to that and be able to alert maintenance team on the ground that they need to prepare for the aircraft to have something or other done to it. If we use the standard append mode, then we can't write any of that data until the aircraft has landed, so that's no good to us. So that's why we're going to use the applyInPandasWithState function. So let's have a little sneak preview at the code. You can see that we have a streaming dataset or data frame called flight data stream, and we want to group that data by the flight ID, and then we want to use our applyInPandasWithState function. So what this is going to do is say, okay, we want you to use this function, and this is a function that we're going to write ourselves called updateState. And that's going to do all the maintenance around looking after what we store in the state, looking after when it expires and all that kind of stuff. So this is going to be the core functionality of how we want to customize our streaming data. We need to specify a few things. So we need to say, what's the output struct type? So we want to say, okay, what's the structure of the data that's going to come out of this thing? And that's going to end up in our data frame results. We also need to specify what is the structure of our state. Remember, this gets stored as a tuple. We specify what mode we're writing in, so we say output mode append, although this doesn't really mean a whole lot because we're customizing it ourselves. And then we say whether we want to have a timeout function or not. So we could, for example, set this to timeout every 5 minutes. Although in our case, what we want to do is set this to timeout when the aircraft lands. So the state would be initiated when the flight takes off, and then when the flight lands, then we would close the state. So we can implement that functionality ourselves, or we can customize that in the function updateState. We might also want a catch-all, so we could set this to have a timer. So if we know that none of our flights last more than 5 hours, let's say it's Ryanair and they're a European operator, then we could say if, for example, we had some kind of random issue where we were unable to actually say that the flight had landed, then we could automatically close the state after 5 hours, for example. So this will return a set of data or a batch of data that's outputted by our updateState function, and that's going to end up in this df result table. So that manages our state, but we're also going to want to write that data. We want to write that out to a delta table. So we get our data frame, we say we want to write that stream, and because we want to do upserts on our delta table, we're going to call this for each batch. So that will run every time a new batch of data is streamed. And we specify what function we want to run. And so inside here, we're going to have an upsert statement, which will take the output of the data and update our delta table. We also specify that we're going to do it in append mode. And because all of this is stored in memory, we also keep checkpoints. So we've got an option that says checkpoint location, so that if the whole thing falls over, then we can pick up from our last checkpoint. And we say that we want to start the stream. So hopefully that gives you a basic idea of what we want to do. In the next video, we're going to do some prerequisite work. So we're going to set up some test streaming data that we can use to run through this process. And in the final video, then we'll do the full run through of how to actually write all elements of the applyInPandasWithState function. If you are interested in videos on data engineering, data science, AI, maths, and physics, then please do subscribe to this channel and you'll find lots more content like this across those topic areas. You should see a link on the screen that will take you to the next video. Thank you very much, and hopefully I will see you in that video.